All right, so we're going to talk about color now. And so last week we learned shapes, and we learned about the two different types of shapes, and we made a composition using shapes. This week we're going to make a composition just using color. So we're going to simplify the shapes and focus more on color. So I'm going to set up a really, really simple example, and then I'm just going to add some colors. So I'm just going to add some rectangles here. So I'm going to add, or I'm going to do squares actually. So I'm going to add a square that's the size of the whole sketch. So I'll call this big square. And then I'll add another square that's half the size. This will be medium square. And then I'll add half the size of that, small square. And I actually want to center these. So I don't think I actually talked about this last week, but there's different modes that we can draw our geometry from. So if I change rect mode, this is like the mode that it draws squares. I can draw squares from the center. And so now what I'll do is I'll just draw each of these squares in the middle of my canvas. So that everything is centered. I didn't really talk about this last time, so I should have spent more time on this, but I'll just put a comment here that says draw squares and rectangles from the center. Okay, so we've got some squares, and now we're going to add some color. And we'll do this in a few different ways. So one thing I want to look at real quick, I'm going to open up the Adobe color wheel. This is going to be useful to have open, maybe more so a little bit later. But I'm also going to open up this website called HTML Color Codes. This is a really useful website for looking up different colors for the web. And we'll see that in P5, we have the ability to use lots of different types of values to define the color that we want to use for our shapes. So that's why I say color values. And let's also really quick just look into the reference and go to color. And you'll see there's a bunch of functions related to color. We're going to use, in the first bit of class, we're going to use fill and stroke. In the second bit of class, we'll talk about color mode. So with our shapes, you can see that there's two different places where the color is applied. One is the fill, the middle of the shape, and one is the stroke or the outline of the shape. Last week, we looked at how you can turn either one of those off. So I can say no fill. If I say no fill, it'll remove the fills from my shapes. If I say no stroke, it'll remove the outlines from the shapes. If I want to set the color of either the fill or the stroke, so I can say set fill color, I just use the fill function. And that'll apply to all of the shapes that come after I use the fill. And we can use any different value that we want. So if I click on the fill function, you'll see in these examples, there's grayscale. We've already seen that with the background. The background just uses one number, and that sets a grayscale color. There's also RGB. That's the default, where we use the red, green, and blue. There's also HSB, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And then there's also CSS colors that have names, like red. And there's also hex code that we can use that's CSS uses as well. So we can use a lot of different ways of defining color. So we've already kind of looked at grayscale. If I want to use an RGB color, so remember that RGB is just a combination of values of red, green, and blue. If we look at the color wheel and we kind of take a look at one of these, you can see, if we have no red, green, or blue, we just have a black color. If we have all red, we get a red color. If we have all green, we get a green color. all blue, we get a blue color. And then if we mix these values at different amounts, we get different colors. Okay, so if I want to fill with RGB, I can just write in some colors. So for example, if I want a blue color, I can say 0, 0, 255. And we'll get this blue color, and you can see that it's applying to every square in my composition. Everything that comes after the fill is going to have the color. So we can also set stroke or outline color. So we can do this using stroke. If I want a red stroke, I'll say 255, 0, 0. And I'll get a red stroke. I'm going to turn the stroke weight up a little bit just because it's going to be hard to see otherwise. So I'm going to set the stroke weight to 8. Okay, so now you can see those colors. So there's a high degree of contrast in these colors because 255 is like all of the blue, but none of the red or green. And then here, 255 is all of the red, but none of the green or blue. So we get these really bright, saturated colors. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but RGB is kind of hard to use because we don't really think of color as like a mix of red, green, and blue. We tend to think of color as a particular hue, like red, green, blue, yellow, orange, and then how light or dark or how saturated or desaturated it is. So trying to mix with RGB is kind of difficult. Let's imagine, for blue, instead of blue, I wanted something like a dark purple. I would have to say, okay, if I want a dark purple, I definitely need a lot of blue, so let's leave the blue in there. But I probably need some red, so maybe I would add some red. Okay, that's kind of pinkish, so maybe I need a little bit of green in there to balance out. That's still kind of pinkish. Maybe I need a little less blue because it's too bright. Okay, now it's kind of more red, so maybe I need a little less red. Okay, now I'm starting to get in the zone where I want. Do I need more green? That doesn't feel like it's part of purple, but so you can, anyway, you get the point. It's gonna be difficult for me to mix colors just with my brain. So there's a couple ways we can deal with that. One is by using math. The other is by using a different way of talking about color. For now, we're just gonna leave this here. So I can also, let's set a slightly different red, because this is way too much red. Let's do like 200. Another thing we can do while we're here, we might as well show this. I can also add alpha or transparency. So let's say we wanted our outlines to blend in a little bit with our shapes. I could add a little transparency. The transparency by default uses the same scale as our default colors, which is 0 to 255. So if I say 255, it's going to be the same. If I say 0, it's completely transparent. If I say something like 100, now it's a little bit see-through. It's kind of hard to tell here because there's no overlapping, but you can see it's blending in a little bit with our background colors. Okay, so let's add some other colors. So I'll let these apply to my big square, but let's add some colors down here to our medium square. So another thing we can do is just use HTML names for colors. So sometimes that's easier because we can just use a name that represents the color that we want. So if I go to HTML color codes and I go to names, you can see that the names are organized by sort of general colors. So if I wanted a nice purple color, I could go to purple, and then I could just, look at these and see which one is closest to what I'm going for, and then choose one. It's interesting that some of these actually have blue in the name, even though they're in the purple section. But so let's go with dark orchid. That sounds pretty nice to me. So I'm going to copy that. And so for my medium square, I'll say fill, and I'll just put in dark orchid. If you're used to writing CSS, you would just write it like this. But JavaScript is not directly connected to CSS. It references CSS. So to use dark orchid, we actually have to put quotation marks around it. And this lets us know that we're using a CSS value. And now you can start to see some of the transparency there because our outline is covering two different fills. Let's actually make it even a little bit bigger. I'll make it 16. Okay, so we're seeing a little bit of some interesting stuff there. Okay. So now you can see the dark orchid is applying to my medium square and my small square because they come after. But my big square is still using this random whatever color this is up here. So the same sort of order of operations applies. Okay, if we want to change the stroke here, besides CSS names, we can also use hex values. So let's say we're looking at some names and I'm like, oh, okay, let's look for a yellow. Let's get a nice yellow color. So let's say we find a nice yellow color, maybe khaki, but it's not quite as bright as I want. So if I click on khaki, it'll make it the main color up here. And then I could go back to the picker and I could move this around and get something a little bit brighter. And then it's gonna tell me the RGB, but it also tells me the hex value. So I can use either one of those in my sketch. So just as an example, if I wanna use the hex value, I can use that and go to stroke, and I have to use the quotation marks again. Okay, so now we get this nice yellow stroke. So it's not exactly a color name, but I can capture the value using this hex value. The other thing that's kind of nice about the hex value that you might notice is that there's a little dot right here that shows the color. And if I open this up, there's a built-in color picker, which is a CSS thing. And I can modify that color. I can make it even brighter. And I can make changes to the color directly in the editor. So that's kind of convenient, if you want to just stay in the editor and not have to go over to another tab to find colors. Let me put some comments in here because I'm realizing I need to red. This is red, green, blue. This is red, green, blue, alpha. Hi, Savannah, right? Okay. How's it going? I'm just writing your name down. Yeah. Okay. This is a CSS color name, and this is a CSS, or it's not really CSS, but it comes from CSS hex value. Okay. So let's add another color down here. Well, actually, we're going to talk about color modes later. Is there anything else we want to? Yeah, no, we'll talk about color modes later. So I'll just add one more color here. I'm just going to kind of guess. I want to do something. I don't even know really what I want to do. Let's start with our color that we started with up here. And then I'll just kind of change some stuff and see what happens. So what if we take that color and I subtract 20 from each value? So since I'm subtracting it from each number, I'm just going to end up with something darker, right? If I'm subtracting color from red, green, and blue channels, it's going to stay the same basic hue, but darker. So if I do -50, -50, -50, now I get even a little bit darker. So that's kind of nice. I'll do the same thing with a stroke. If I want to do a stroke, but I want to do some math with it, obviously I can't do math on this text, but if I click on this, I can figure out what the RGB value is if I look in these boxes. Although I think because I'm in dark mode, they're hard to see. Oh, but I can change it to RGB. So now I can just see the numbers here. So let's put in 255, 229, and 0. And I want to keep that example, so I'm going to do undo and then just paste that back in. Okay, so let's do the same thing. I'll do -50, -50, and then 0. Obviously, -50 of 0 is just going to still be 0 because we can't go negative with our colors. Okay, so now we have this darker yellow. Okay, so it's not the most beautiful composition in the world, but we're starting to have a little bit of fun with color, and we've covered all the different ways We can do color. So let's just say doing some math. Okay. So I'm going to save this sketch, and I'll just use this as an example. So I'll add this to our class collection. And so in the second part of class, I'm going to talk about using different ways to mix color. And we'll also look at some examples of work by Joseph Albers, who you guys may be familiar with if you've taken like history of graphic design or something like that. But he was a painter who did a lot of experiments with colors. And so we'll do a project that's sort of slightly inspired by his work. So we'll talk about that in the second part of class. I'm going to stop the